Thank you, and thank you all for coming. So 3 preliminaries. First, this work on Smith is likely to be part of a series of papers on the theme of justifying suffering. So it's sort of beginning with Adam Smith, perhaps there'll be a chapter on Hegel, may wind its way through the marginalist economists, Alfred Marshall, Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, maybe Pareto, and end with an examination of the kind of nexus of kind of contemporary rationalist IPE, that IPE fashionable in the United States, and contemporary economics. And I try to read these texts as an international theorist and sort of not just a political theorist. And looking back on my work with Naeem, I think we've kind of made a specialty of doing critical readings of the justifications for capitalism. But I think not simply as kind of ideology critique, but also recognizing that these justifications are in fact integral to or internal to what we mean by capitalism itself. So, second, over the last couple decades, Smith has been recovered from what I think are narrow and stultifying readings, which have been given both by his acolytes and his critics. And I think rescuing Smith from the Philistines is in fact a noble goal, but I think, and I think his frank assessments of the kind of social evils of commercial society, which I'll talk about, is actually instructive and part of his genuine greatness. But I don't want to underestimate, as I think some have, the apologetics of his work. Third, Smith's work is laden with references to providence, and I think that's well known. But only rarely have scholars noticed that Smith's justificatory system takes the form of theodicy, that he works to preserve the goodness of the plan of nature, a term he uses, by adducing good from moral failings, also language he uses, and explaining social ills as a necessary and even relatively good feature of the natural order. This is not, I think, to make any particular claim about Smith's religious beliefs. And I don't think my argument actually depends on being able to say exactly what Smith's religious beliefs are. So however secular we take his categories to be, his justificatory system performs a theodicy, whether as a secularized theological practice or as a response to what I would call the necessary structural gaps in the modern symbolic order that I think parallel those same gaps that existed in sort of the Christian cosmos. And it's worth noting, I think, that no matter how old the practice of reconciling evil with the goodness of God in his creation, theodicy only comes to be a recognized category in the Enlightenment with Leibniz. Okay, so that's the preliminaries. So my argument is that Smith's justification of capitalism is actually kind of a vexed and complicated organization. He certainly he claims the plan of nature is good. He recognizes the moral failings and social evils of a commercial society, but in some combination, he revalues certain of those social failings or evils as good, or he describes these evils and failings as a cost necessary to social advance and therefore good from a deeper point of view. And at points, he invokes a visible hand to correct the problems of God's natural order, or he completely disavows or denies the implications of his own thought that reveals certain social evils that are not smoothed over by the invisible hand. So I'll work through those sort of a less brief sketch of what I think Adam Smith is working at, and then end with a few conclusions. I draw some comparisons between Smith and a few other thinkers. So, Smith's incomplete Theodicy in 5 steps. Okay, this is really schematic, and somewhere implicit in there is a reading of Augustine and Leibniz, which will only rear its head at certain points. Okay, so step 1. Theodicy begins with the assumption of a good creation, since a perfect being cannot but create the best possible world. Likewise, Smith affirms the goodness of the natural order, the aim of which, implanted by the Creator, is to promote human happiness via the possibilities for material improvement and the cultivation of virtue and moral advance. The primitive of human nature in this system, or in the plan of nature, is a social impulse or sympathy. Our interactions with others lead us, Smith argues, to a moral sense, which is conditioned by our attunement to others' views, or what we take other views to be, of good behavior, virtue, and unacceptable behavior. In this way, these interactions, or let's say society emerges from these interactions in its, I think, best possible and sustainable form. And though very few people, Smith admits, live up to the highest ideals of love and virtue, even what he calls relatively vulgar and obvious motivations produce socially valuable behavior that creates wealth. Now, from the point of view of natural order, the expansion of wealth is not, in fact, an end in itself. Wealth is valuable for Smith because it creates moral refinement and institutional advance. And Smith captures that with a kind of a universal or conjectural history, where humanity or history unfolds through certain stages, bringing us to the height or the apex of the modern commercial era. Step 2. However, evil and suffering are present within this harmonious natural order. And I stress within the order because Smith has been turned by modern economists into a kind of Manichaean, a heresy that locates the source of social ills sort of outside of or beyond the workings of God's creation, or in this case, the natural order, right? Or more to the point, unnatural government intrusions into commerce or the market are what create these social ills in the kind of usual economist account, a kind of dualism of good and evil. In that case, right, moral failings, or for Smith, moral failings and social ills are in fact a feature of a singular and relatively harmonious social order. So in various places, Smith recognizes that human failings, both in virtue and reason, limit the achievement of happiness and may in fact threaten the stability of social order. Also, he acknowledges the problems of inequality and the suffering of those who fall into poverty, despite the great successes of commercial society. He famously provides a searing commentary on the effects of the technical division of labor. And he notes the evils of colonial conquest and slavery that have accompanied the spread of commerce. Social evils that remain sort of within the commercial order. But step 3. And here, in parallel to Augustine and Leibniz, Smith works to preserve the goodness of the natural order despite the presence of evil and suffering. So, he adopts a strategy of revaluing certain evils so that they appear as good or necessary to the good, and necessary to the good plan of nature. So most famously, self-regarding, read maybe selfish behavior may be thought of as a form of virtue, where it is practiced moderately or prudently, as what Smith would call self-command. More strongly, Smith explains, like Augustine and Leibniz, that good is adduced from these apparent moral failings and social ills. So, just as God's plan turns evil towards the good of eventual salvation, Smith argues that the invisible hand turns these narrow, even vulgar motivations, like self-seeking, or worse, kind of extravagance, into wealth. Even vain and profligate consumption by the rich serves to sort of spread out incomes to many people. And the lust for wealth and power as an end in itself, though in fact not serving the happiness of those who have that lust, does serve to spur humanity to greater industry and invention. So it is with inequality in his account, where nature turns differences in rank that many, read Aristotle, Adam Ferguson, Rousseau, thought to destabilize society, he turns those ranks into a force for social and political order. Because, he says, our natural moral sentiments tend to always lead us to defer to wealth and power rather than challenging it. Finally, and very much like Leibniz and Augustine, redemption comes temporally in Smith's system. Though I'm flattening a bit the differences between Christian eschatology and Enlightenment theories of progress, Smith does embrace a very salutary story, this universal or conjectural history, in which human productive powers are enhanced, manners are refined, and social relationships made more peaceful. The problem of poverty, which Smith identifies, also receives a temporal resolution. Smith wants to connect poverty with the beginnings of human society, where there's a limited division of labor and limited or no surplus. He draws the contrast. In a commercial society with its extensive division of labor, even the common people live better than savage kings. A famous line he stole from Locke and probably some others. Smith makes a similar temporal claim about colonial expansion, promising that the natural processes of the spread of wealth creation will eventually lead to a kind of balance of power between peoples and nations that will check that kind of colonial aggression. Point 4. Like all theodicies, Smith's remains incomplete. There are sort of cracks in the symbolic order, some of which at least he recognizes. And at many of those points where Smith no longer can appeal to kind of the redemptive smoothing of the invisible hand, instead he turned to a visible hand. The visible hand in the form of public education in order to remedy the worst effects of the technical division of labor, or to governmental support for public entertainment in order to divert the downtrodden masses from irrational religious enthusiasm, and in the form of the civil magistrate who defends the property of the rich against the resentment and desperation of the poor. Or at points, and I think this is really important, is that Smith also subverts and inverts the invisible hand argument at various points. So while narrow and vulgar self-interested behavior may well support a social good of wealth creation without ever intending it, narrow and vulgar self-interested behavior, Smith explains, is ultimately self-defeating for the individuals who practice it. Right? It actually leads them away from virtue and happiness, even though its unintended consequence is to lead to this kind of restless desire for more. Thus, the social good of economic growth or development for Smith does not necessarily correspond with the good or happiness of many or most individuals, as is generally presumed when the invisible hand is invoked these days. To put it differently, Smith's natural order is not Pareto optimal. Okay, step 5. Where theodicies, where cracks in the theodicies are exposed, sometimes our practitioner may in fact resort to acts of denial or disavowal. So that cracks in the theodicies are perhaps covered as opposed to explored. So I think some key examples. Smith's explanation of the natural wage rate seems to preserve at least subsistence for common laborers and their families, or at least that's what he says. But the supply of labor turns on population dynamics, including increased or decreased infant mortality rates. Here, the subsistence wage offered by the market requires a necroeconomics, and I'm appropriating this term from Warren Montag, in which some must be allowed to die or must allow themselves to die for want of subsistence in order to bring wages back to their normal level. Okay. I think to his discredit, this is really clear in Smith's example, but he does not, I think, highlight what is obvious. Smith's account of market dynamics and famine suggests that merchants regulate prices. They do this automatically in their own self-interest in a way that preserves the supply of grain until the next harvest or through the next harvest. What he fails to note is that there's nothing in the market function to guarantee that those who need grain will survive until the next harvest. And I think this seems to sort of escape his notice or mention. Smith's temporal resolution of the problem of poverty relies on an idea of subsistence or absolute poverty. Yet Smith himself recognizes that poverty is importantly relative. Where poverty involves social comparison, and the relevant social comparisons that Smith discusses are not in other societies to savage kings, but to those who are more well off in his own society, the advantages, I think, for the poor are lost. Because psychological suffering, he notes, is produced by our natural sentiments which always favor the rich and revile the poor. So poverty now appears less to be resolved by a commercial society and more a consequence of a complex division of labor, which in fact inverts Smith's universal history as a story of sort of growth towards affluence. Finally, Smith suggests that the logic of commerce itself will gradually abolish slavery. But his own account suggests that the motives for domination and slavery actually are more complicated than just commercial motives. They grow from a kind of desire for control and domination, a kind of will to power. And he explains that certain forms of commerce appear to be quite consistent with slavery. His example is sugar production. And he might well have added mining and sex work while he was at it. Okay. At these key points in the text, Smith, I think, asks us to act as if his system of natural liberty has produced the promised harmonious effects, as if he has covered the cracks in his Theodicy, when in fact it appears he has not. So, let me offer a kind of summary suggest what I think this means. So, first, for Hegel, where does he come from? private and public, civil society and state are joined in a totality, dialectically produced via a process of historical learning, roughly. As a totality, history includes progress, but it also includes the costs, the suffering necessary to the learning process. Here we have a whole. There's no outside on which to displace the cost. And Hegel recognizes his philosophy of history as a theodicy. He says that. And where Marx engages history as a dialectical unfolding of a social totality, I think he too risks engaging in theodicy. Second, today's methodological individualists are quite distinct from Smith in that they refuse the larger social whole any ontological weight or reality. Right? The social whole or society exists only in the sense that it is a realization of individual traits and behaviors mediated through voluntary transactions in markets. The fact that individual behaviors add up to, mediated through the market, add up to desirable outcomes via something like the invisible hand suggests, I think, the continuing providential or idealistic faith element remaining in economist thinking. And this appreciation of the positive energy generated by the freeing of the individual does harken back to Smith, but this is not quite Smith. Economists tend to displace, and I've already hinted at this, any cost outside of the market system. When fully implemented, the market produces optimal outcomes for society and for the individual, right? This is the miracle of Pareto optimality, right? Just as free trade promotes optimal outcomes for the globe and for each participant. The only cost in this system occur when there's interference in the market from outside. Economists usually often pitting a good, efficient market order against an always inefficient politics state. Okay. The system remains theological, but I think in a Manichaean form. Right? There's no need for a theodicy for neoclassical economists to justify any necessary costs because there are no necessary costs in a market because they've displaced them all outside. Right? Any cost exists only because the extent of market function remains incomplete or impaired. Okay. It's a very elegant system. Okay. Smith is not elegant. Right? He's more complicated, he's richer and nuanced, maybe even contradictory, but I think also much superior to his claimed descendants. And I think most importantly, despite his limits, he provides us a vocabulary, one that's to replace the completely impoverished vocabulary that neoclassical economists provide us for thinking about costs. And for that reason, I think it's worth going back to Smith. One coda. So, nothing I have said about Smith or any of these others suggests that theodicy is avoidable. Or, in other words, that we can avoid the need to justify suffering. I'm not sure that we can avoid that need. And if so, then we face, I think, the responsibility of owning up to the costs of the social imaginaries or political economic projects that we embrace. Okay. In that respect, and I think despite his limits, we have sort of a lot to learn from Adam Smith.
Thank you very much, David.